Today's topic is going to be neurophysiology, and this topic encompasses the spinal tracts and the motor system and the core pieces of our brain and our memory, not our memory, but like our brain physiology and anatomy, right? Making sure that we know what the sections of the brain are and what they do. This will also include some of the nuclei as well, just making sure we have a full picture of the functionality of the brain and how our brain transmits signals to our spinal cord. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is actually the levels of the central nervous system. So we're talking about how the cerebrum is going to transmit signals to the brainstem and then finally to the spinal cord. And remember, we can have lesions at any point along this track. So from the cerebrum to the brainstem to the spinal cord, there can be lesions anywhere. And these lesions, we can identify them based on the signs and symptoms of the patient. So it's going to be really important to understand how these signals transmit so that way we can accurately identify where the lesions are in question stems. So this is just your simple picture of our brain anatomy, right? The different gyri, the different sulci, and what we would expect to see at different parts of the brain. So of course we know that the brain is separated into like the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, all of the parietal lobe. But really important for answering a lot of these is making sure that we can identify where the central sulcus is specifically and learning how to map the brain out that way. So the central sulcus is going to be almost like the longest portion when you're looking at it at the brain from this view. And when we look at a real brain, sometimes it can be really hard to identify. But I think for me, what has always helped is going to find that longest sulcus that we can identify and the one that's closest to the middle. So if you're not careful, you might accidentally identify the central sulcus as being before the precentral gyri here, the gyrus here. But remember, you should have a pretty straight line that goes from the very top of the brain, the parietal area, all the way down to meeting the temporal area of the brain and going straight down, dividing two very long gyri. That is your central sulcus. And the reason why I say this is the one that's the most important to identify is because this is the one that's going to help us to identify very important parts of our brain. Namely, remember that our precentral gyrus is responsible for our primary motor information. This guy here is what helps us do the majority of our movement. Of course, right before this, we also have our premotor cortex too, right? So our premotor cortex, this is area 4, our primary, and our premotor cortex, which is like makes up part of our precentral sulcus and like this area of our brain here, most of this stuff here in this area, that's our premotor cortex. And this is responsible for the planning portion of our motor function. So in area 6, or the premotor cortex, we kind of plan out our movements. And then in our primary motor cortex, that's what's kind of carrying out the movements. So these are two very important parts of our brain. And in general, we don't really need the numbers anymore. Using the numbers is a very old school method. We might still see them on the CAS exams, but when you get to STEP, usually they're going to ask you for the names of these areas. They don't usually ask you for the numbers. But sometimes the numbers can be important just for a few of these, which is why I'm mentioning what the numbers for these are. Right after the precentral sulcus, we have our primary somatosensory cortex, which is what makes up most of our post-central gyrus. So this is primary somatosensory, aka areas 3, 1, and 2. So again, another very important piece of the puzzle here, because the motor cortex part is what we're going to talk about with our corticospinal tract. And then we have our primary somatosensory part, which we're going to talk about with the spinal thalamic and the dorsal columns portions. All of these different spinal tracts that we're going to be talking about all have to come back up to the cerebrum at some point. And this is where that information is all going to be processed at. And we'll get into more of these areas in detail in a few slides, but I just wanted to bring up why we need to know about these areas and why they are important, because they can ask you in the question stem to identify these areas based on the patient's signs and symptoms. They're not always going to be straightforward, but if the patient is having primarily upper motor neuron symptoms, and again, we'll go through upper motor neuron versus lower motor neuron symptoms in a little bit, just as a refresher, but if we're experiencing upper motor neuron symptoms, there's a good chance that it could be affecting our primary motor cortex. And so they could ask us to identify the precentral gyrus in a question. And I think I have an example of that later on when we go through some practice questions, but just to identify the very important why. Why do we need to know this? Well, it's all about passing that exam, right? That's it. So here it is, me pointing out again why this is so important. So we're going to get into a little bit of a histology of the cerebral cortex next to really identify what we need to know about the cerebrum and what we need to know when it comes down to this tract. So we're starting very large, right? Very large, and we're going to go down into the spinal cord a little bit later. This is still referring to our motor tract right now. We are currently taking a deep dive into our primary motor cortex to look at the layers of it. And what we're seeing here is that there's 6 different layers, but the most important layer that you need to remember is layer 5, which contains these internal pyramidal cells. It is the ganglionic layer. This is where the magic happens. This is where our brain, our connections, our neurons are all connected to in the cerebrum. It's called lamina 5, again, part of the primary motor cortex in the 4th layer. And this is where we're going to drop, this is the start of our contralateral corticospinal tract. Well, I'll just call it our corticospinal tract. This is the beginning of it. This is what we need right here. So starting in the cerebrum, we are going to send neurons through our corona radiata into the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This part is so important. I have seen so many questions where they ask about the internal capsule and what it does. For the most part, our internal capsule is carrying motor fibers. So this is so, so important to remember and so high yield that we are going from layer 5 in the cerebrum of our primary motor cortex through the corona radiata into the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Next thing that's going to happen is we're going to go through the cerebral peduncle, the crus cerebri, specifically like the middle 3/5 of it. Then, so we're in the cerebral peduncle, we're going into the brainstem, which is the basis pontis, and now we're going into the medulla, and this is where another piece of the magic happens. Again, we're still talking about how we are transmitting fibers from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. Okay, that's what we're still talking about here. Once we get to the pyramid of the medulla in the brainstem, our fibers are going to cross. They're going to cross over. Now, this is important because any lesion above this point, any lesion that is above the medulla is going to produce a contralateral response in the lower limbs or wherever the motor response is. However, any lesion below this, at this point, is going to produce an ipsilateral response. And I think this is the hardest part about the tracts. When we're talking about the tracts, we're always trying to figure out, well, is it contralateral? Is it ipsilateral? How do we figure that out? Always remember your decussations, because once you remember your decussations, you will always know what type of response it's going to produce. So for both, we have two tracts that have decussations in the brainstem. That is our corticospinal, and that is our dorsal columns. Both of these guys decussate in the brainstem. So for both these tracts, any lesions above the brainstem are going to produce a contralateral response. And any lesions below the brainstem in the spinal cord will produce that ipsilateral response. This is true. It is not unique to just the corticospinal. The spinothalamic is a little different, but we'll talk about that. The important part to remember, though, is as long as you know where the decussation is at. If it is above the decussation, it will be a contralateral. If it is below the decussation, it will be an ipsilateral. That will always be true. All right, so still going back to our corticospinal tract now for a moment, we can see we are in the spinal cord now, finally, after going through the medulla, and now we are in the lateral corticospinal tract, and I'm showing you here in this drawing where that is at in the spinal cord. This is going to be another really important piece that we're going to have to remember, is where these locations are in the spinal cord. So now I just want to show you what's happening in the spinal cord. So this is the white matter tract. This big blue dot, that is the white matter tract. But remember, it is not our white matter that is the functional part per se. We need the gray matter. The gray matter is where we synapse the neurons. That's where all of our neuronal responses come and synapse at. So that's why I'm showing you here, even though this isn't totally accurate for like how this tract is happening, I'm giving you a visual representation of how you should think about white matter and gray matter tracts. So once we get to the level of the spinal cord where this functionality is going to take place, meaning I want you to think about the dermatomes here. When we think about our dermatomes, that's what's telling us where the level of function is going to be at. And this is the same thing, this is the same that's true for the motor tract, right? So once we get to the level of the spinal cord where the functionality is happening, for example, we know like our cervical region, upper thoracic region is for our arms, right? Once we get to that point, all of those fibers are going to go and synapse to neurons that we find in the gray matter. And now this is the beautiful thing here, right? This part is very, very crucial too. I want to point out to you that this horn here in the back of the spinal cord is where these fibers are going into. That's another reason why I said this picture isn't quite accurate, because this horn is where the sensory neurons are going to come into. This is all still considered to be like an upper motor neuron lesion at this point, okay? So this is still considered upper motor neuron. It doesn't become a lower motor neuron until those fibers leave up here. Once those fibers leave, that's when they are considered to be lower motor neurons. So this is the dorsal horn back here, and this is the ventral horn up here. Now I'm mentioning this here, but we're going to talk about the spinal tracts and the corticospinal tract again, like in detail, but I'm mentioning this here so that way you know there's a difference between an ipsilateral response, a contralateral response, an upper motor neuron response, and a lower motor neuron response. When I talk about contralateral versus ipsilateral, that is always, always, always referring to the decussation. But when we're talking about an upper motor neuron versus a lower motor neuron, we are talking about the neuron synapse and where the fibers are traveling in the spinal cord itself. So upper motor neuron comes in here through the dorsal horn of the gray matter, synapses onto neurons that we find in the ventral horn of the gray matter. And then once they leave, shown in this picture by the yellow and the orange, that's when it finally becomes a lower motor neuron. And I want you to recognize this. A lower motor neuron will always be the result of an ipsilateral lesion. Now, I hope after what I said that this makes sense to you, because a lower motor neuron lesion will always be below the decussation. Always, always, always. So lower motor neuron lesions will always be the result of an ipsilateral lesion. It's your upper motor neuron problems that become a little bit more complicated because it can be anywhere along an ipsilateral or a contralateral tract. So you'll have to do some anatomy searching to find that part out, which part of the upper motor neuron tract actually has the lesion. But if you see anything lower motor neuron, boom, it's ipsilateral. You're good. All right, so our flexor response, this part is very detailed, and it might be more important to talk about specifically in terms of Med 1 CAS exams, but anything above that, I don't necessarily know that you're going to see this information, so it might not be as pertinent to you. But just for a quick refresher, remember that we have two responses, an extensor response and a flexor response. The flexor response in the cervical region happens because of these things called Betz cells. And these Betz cells don't make up much. They only make up about 10 to 15% of the total amount of neurons that we have. And their job is for very fine motor function. So like using your fingers and stuff like that. The Betz cells are really good for that. They are a type of pyramidal cell, but just remember Betz cells for fine motor function. Fine motor function. All right, so motor control is very dependent on a few different things. We have a few different areas that we need to worry about. So remember we said that we have thoughts that originate in our prefrontal cortex. Those fibers project to the premotor cortex, and then finally our primary motor cortex carries out that function. And so now how does it carry out that function? Well, we have three different ways that the primary motor cortex is going to modulate our function. We have the lateral vestibulospinal tract, the lateral corticospinal tract, and we also have the rubrospinal tract. So there's three ways that our body manipulates our movements. The lateral vestibulospinal tract, that one is primarily for limb extension, primarily. So and again, because we're talking about a lower motor neuron feature here, this tract has only ipsilateral control. It's found in the spinal cord. And what we see here is that it's helping to control, again, limb extension specifically. It does have some flexor response, but that flexor response is mostly due to actually one of our reflexes. And we're not going to talk about reflexes, I don't think, right now, but just know that we have a few different reflexes that help to both promote extension and to inhibit flexion. That's one of our reflexes. So that's kind of why it does have some flexor control, mostly for the point of inhibiting the flexor response to allow for stimulation of the extensor response. This guy has a small role. He's not the biggest role though, right? Of course, our lateral corticospinal tract plays a huge role. And this guy helps us a ton with flexion. So same thing here, right? Except this one's going to be the opposite, where we have positive stimulation to the flexor areas and negative stimulation to the extensor areas. It's always going to work like that, right? And again, I know we're not getting into the reflexes, but I want you to think about what would happen if both your extensor muscles and your flexion muscles activated at the same time. Your arm would just be straight, right? Like you can't both activate your bicep and your tricep at the same time. That just doesn't make sense. So you're going to activate your bicep muscle, which helps to flex the arm, and you're going to relax your tricep. So I know you can't see me, but this is a, okay, wow. That's this is an arm. Okay, there we go. That makes it a little bit more like an arm. We're gonna go with it, right? So here's your bicep muscle that's helping to flex your arm upwards. And at the same time, we want to relax this tricep muscle here. Tricep relax. That's part of our reflex response. And that's all we're doing to modulate our movement, right? We are stimulating the flexion response and we are inhibiting the extensor response. That's the important part to remember there. This is primarily a contralateral response. But again, it can be ipsilateral. We talked about this, right? So want to talk about the last one here, which is the red nucleus, which is primarily a contralateral response here. This one, again, is helping to stimulate further limb flexion of our proximal muscles. You find these nuclei in the midbrain. That's where these nuclei are at, is in the midbrain. So that's why it's contralateral, right? Because we know the midbrain is above the medulla. So since it's above the medulla, that's why we get a contralateral response. So that's, again, helping to stimulate limb flexion as well. So these are the main tracts. This is what they do. But again, of course, in terms of our level of importance, the corticospinal tract is by far a very important one to remember. So this brings up, again, talking more about the lesions again. It is so, so helpful for you to go through and memorize your motor homunculus and your sensory homunculus. I can't say enough how many times this has helped me in test questions. So I always draw this out prior to beginning the test during like my tutorial time, because it's something then that I don't have to think about and I can just kind of remember. And these are very similar, right? But the only difference is we have a little bit of the neck and head that pops up a little bit higher here, and the neck and head pop up a little bit lower over here on the motor side of it. But otherwise, these are very, very similar, right? And we can say almost for sure that if we're talking about the toes or the feet or whatever, we're talking about the distribution of the anterior cerebral artery. And I know that these views are different, right? One of them we're looking at the coronal section, one we're looking at the sagittal section. But I would like to, again, point out that most of that control is happening kind of in the upper portion of our motor cortex here. That's where the anterior cerebral artery is working. Most of this stuff here in the middle is the distribution of our middle cerebral artery. And then, of course, we have our posterior cerebral artery, which kind of does more so like vision and stuff like that, and kind of like the backside. Somewhat in that area. But importantly, I just want you to remember kind of where the distributions of these things are happening at, so it can help you in test questions again. Oh, one more thing to mention here. I know that this is very small. I think I have it a little bit bigger here, but I made sure to draw out where these areas are specifically in the brain, so that way you can compare the different areas of the brain to which sulci and gyrus you need to look for in the picture. I found this specific picture very helpful for me to remember the different areas of the brain and the different gyrus that it wanted me to pick on a test. Specifically, they like to get into the temporal lobe quite a lot, as well as Wernicke's area and Broca's area. I found that those were very, very, very commonly asked. So I would definitely make sure you are very familiar with at least those few areas and which gyrus that they correspond to. So for example, you can see that like Wernicke's area is in this portion here, kind of by the superior temporal gyrus and the angular gyrus. And it's actually pointing to kind of both of them in this picture. So definitely just make sure that you're fully aware of like those areas, because they like those ones a lot. Not to say that they won't ask about the other ones, but just as like the more high yield ones to ask about, it's definitely those. All right, so I said we would talk about upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron, and here it is. So just remember, with an upper motor neuron, everything is usually up. And with a lower motor neuron, everything is usually down. And the only thing that I want to mention here that I find very interesting and kind of confusing is the fasciculations. So fasciculations are almost like mini twitches is what I consider them. And these mini twitches are a lower motor neuron lesion, not an upper motor neuron lesion. And a lot of people miss that. They forget that when you see those mini twitches or those fasciculations, it's telling you it's a lower motor neuron lesion. So be very mindful of that. In addition, you'll notice in the lower motor lesion, you get the flaccid paralysis. So everything should be limp. You get atrophy because everything is limp. So for the most part, if somebody has a spinal cord injury, that's why they get the atrophy and the flaccid paralysis, because spinal cord injuries primarily produce lower motor neuron lesions. There's more than just that, but primarily. If it's something that was caused by, let's say, a stroke, then you might actually see the opposite. You might see somebody with a positive Babinski sign who had a stroke, because again, that could be affecting, if it's in the ACA distribution, that could be affecting the lower limbs and causing a upper motor neuron lesion, right? So things to keep in mind. Those are some of the more important ones. Otherwise, this trend of everything up, everything down holds true for the upper motor neuron lesion versus the lower motor neuron lesion. Okay, so now we'll get into the tracts. We talked about the cerebrum. We talked about how fibers travel from the cerebrum to the brainstem. Now let's talk about that a little bit more and get into some specifics here. So I really, really love this picture here. Once, I don't remember, somebody had sent it to me once or something like that, and I found it so incredibly helpful. It has all of the tracts that you could possibly need to answer any of the questions that they could ask you about. If you know this picture and you know this picture well, then you know your tracts and you should be able to answer any questions that they ask you about this. So I love this picture. Now, they have separated here ascending tracts versus descending tracts. And while I do think it's important to recognize that something like the motor track is descending, whereas something like your sensory tracts are ascending, motor and sensory, which they already have labeled here, it doesn't help you distinguish between contralateral and ipsilateral. So if you thought that that's the difference between ascending and descending, that doesn't really help you much. So we'll talk again about that in detail for each of the tracts, but I just wanted to point that out again really quick. You have your dorsal columns back here, which your dorsal columns are separated further into whether they are part of the lower limb or the upper limb, and the cuneatus is on the outside, and the outside is your upper limb control, and the inside, which is your gracilis, is your lower limb control. And same thing here, I always think about like our own body. I'm just going to use a stick figure here to help. Your arms are out wide, right? You can stretch your arms far wide. So that means that's telling me that that's going to be on the outside of the dorsal columns, whereas your legs are more midline. And so those are going to be on the central part of your columns here. So that's how I always kept those straight. And then of course, gracilis has an L in it for legs. And then cuneatus has a U in it for upper limb. So that's another way that I use to kind of memorize which one is which. Our dorsal columns are responsible for fine touch, vibration, and proprioception. That's what they're doing, fine touch specifically. And I said fine touch specifically because we have our anterior spinal thalamic tract that helps with crude touch. And that's up here at the very front. Our lateral spinal thalamic, which does pain and temperature. We talked about as well, let's see. Those are the most ones that we talked about, but they even have some of the cerebellar tracts in here, which I think is so helpful too. So that way you can see the cerebellar tracts. Remember that cerebellum is mostly responsible for proprioception as well as like balance and things like that. So I kind of keep your cerebellar tracts mostly in mind for those kinds of things like loss of balance, or you can't do your finger agnosia where you can't touch your nose, or like those kinds of things. Now for your motor tracts, again, you can see we talked about the lateral corticospinal a lot already. The rubrospinal, we already mentioned fine motor control is what that one is mostly for. We have a lateral reticulospinal tract, which can inhibit contraction and decrease tone. A medial reticulospinal tract, which helps to increase tone. We also did talk about the vestibulospinal tract, which is for balance and posture. Tectospinal for head and vision coordination. And then of course, your anterior corticospinal, which also again helps with voluntary movement. So yeah, overall, if you know this picture and everything about this picture and you know it well, that's going to serve you very well for being able to answer questions. Don't forget to compare this to a picture, an actual gross image of the spinal cord. You have to know not only what it looks like on a cartoon image, but you need to be able to identify these things on a gross image of a spinal cord section that's stained. So keep that in mind too. It might not be as clear as the cartoon image. So just know in general where these different tracts are lying at, or where these different tracts are at. So that way you can kind of just, I don't want to say like guess, but have an educated guess on what it might be pointing to. Let's say if it asks you about this area. Oh, blue is not a good color. If it asks you about this area, if they point to that area, then you might be like, okay, that's probably the lateral corticospinal tract that they're asking about. And here's another good image. This one's from first aid, where it kind of breaks down the different areas for you. Again, you can see it's not as crystal clear. So you really have to have a decent understanding of where you think these tracts are at in order to fully remember them. Because it's not, the gross image and the staining is not so straightforward. And here's another image from first aid, kind of again, breaking it down for you. But one thing I wanted to point out that I haven't said yet is this lateral portion of the spinal cord that contains the lateral horn. This lateral horn here is where the fibers for Horner syndrome are transmitted. And this is everything kind of above, we find this in like the thoracic area. This is where the only area of the spinal cord where we really see this specifically. So keep that in mind, that if there is a lesion to the lateral horn, you should be expecting Horner syndrome because it's carrying the sympathetic ganglion in this area. For a refresher, I guess I should mention what Horner syndrome is, right? It's made up of 3 things in particular: ptosis, meiosis, and anhydrosis. So you have the drooping eyelid, the small pupil, and an inability to sweat. And then another really good picture. This one's actually coming from UWorld, and I just like kind of the 3D aspect of it. So obviously I put lots of pictures for you here. Whichever one helps you to understand what you need to know the best, have at it, right? Like I prefer the first image, but some people get overwhelmed by that first image. So in any case, as long as you are sure of like these different areas, I guess I should say, of the spinal cord, and you know which tracts are running in those areas, then you're good to go. So whatever picture you like best. We know the dorsal columns now: pressure, vibration, fine touch. We know the spinal thalamic is pain and temperature. We know that the corticospinal is for voluntary movement. Now we need to, again, revisit the idea of the decussations. This part is so, so important in understanding contralateral versus ipsilateral. As a side note, I have seen them ask how many neurons are part of this, right? So for the most part, we have 2 neurons that are part of almost all of these tracts, right? We have the first one, as it says here, where it's talking about the different neurons. The first one that's kind of going from wherever it's starting from. So in the ascending tracts, it's coming from the area where we sensed the information to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord to the brainstem, and then from the brainstem, it's usually going to the brain, or the specific area of the brain from there, right? So that's always a really important piece to kind of recognize. And the corticospinal tract is a little bit unique in this sense. Again, we'll kind of bring it up again as we get there. Actually, yeah, let's just move into that so we can kind of explain it a little bit better. So let's start with the dorsal columns. These, I'm sure you've seen these images before, maybe not the specific one, but it's really good at helping us understand the synapses specifically, and kind of like what we're supposed to be looking for, I guess, in terms of these tracts. So this is an ascending tract. And the only thing that ascending tells us is where this process is starting at. So we are starting here in E. This is where we start, because this is where the sensation is first felt. So we're going to start here in this ganglion here. And you can see, because this is a sensory pathway, look what we're going through. We are going to enter here in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. Because I already told you, the dorsal aspect of the cervical, of the spinal cord is for sensation. And we go from here right to our white matter, because the white matter is what is carrying the tract. The white matter carries the tract. So now we're going from here, the level of the spinal cord, we're going up. And the next thing that they're showing you is just kind of where the tract is going, and then the decussation. The decussation that's happening here. I said that slower because it's so important on where the decussation happens. This is the medulla of the brainstem. B, C, and D are the brainstem. D is the medulla, C is the pons, B is the midbrain. So here, D is so important. This is where the decussation happens at. So what does this tell you? If there is a lesion anywhere between this point to this point, prior to the decussation, that will all cause ipsilateral symptoms. Always. If the problem is a lesion above this point, that will always be contralateral, always. Because the brain is always working on our contralateral side. So until the fibers cross over, it's going to be contralateral. And once it crosses over, now the fibers are traveling on the same side we would experience the lesion. That will always be ipsilateral at that point. That's the most important piece of this. The most important piece. So important. So that's what they're going to test you on. That's what they're really going to ask you about. They could, again, like I said, ask you about the synapses or the neurons or whatever. You guys can see from this image that we have one very important synapse here in the spinal cord at the sensory nerve ending. And then we have another very important synapse here that's happening in the actual medulla here, where the decussation is happening at. And then we're going to travel up to our end point, which is the VPL thalamus. I'm going to mention this again a little later, but you can always remember that it's going to be the VPL nucleus, because you think of like VPPPL or something is the mnemonic. All of your sensory stuff goes here. Vibration, pressure, proprioception. I don't remember what the other P is, but you get the point. We'll go over it. I think I have the mnemonic actually written down in a couple slides. So now the spinothalamic tract is our weird one, because this guy is the only one that doesn't actually decussate in the brainstem. This guy chose to be a butt and decussate in the spinal cord. And that makes it annoying. It makes it annoying because it makes thinking about where the lesion is a little bit more tricky for people. But again, let me explain it as best I can by saying it doesn't matter where the decussation is happening at. If it is at the level of the lesion, it will be an ipsilateral problem. If it's anywhere else except at the level of the lesion, it's going to be contralateral, because everything else is contralateral. So let me explain it like this. If the lesion is right here, that's the only spot that it can be at to be an ipsilateral problem, because after that, everything else is going to cause contralateral symptoms. So only at the level of the lesion will this ever be ipsilateral. Otherwise, it's always going to be contralateral. So it's weird. It's a weird one because it's a very specific spot where it has to be an ipsilateral lesion. Everything else will be contralateral. So we have our neuron, our nociceptor for pain, or our thermoreceptor for temperature. That's going to synapse in the same spot of our dorsal horn here, same spot. And then immediately it's going to decussate. Immediately it's going to go to its white matter tract and then go straight up all the way again to our VPL nucleus. And that's where it's going to arrive at the primary somatosensory cortex as a third order neuron. So same thing with these first two. Dorsal column and spinal thalamic have 3 neurons and 3 synapses, and it's going to be our upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron that actually have 2, I believe. So let's go to that now. So this guy has our upper motor neuron, and our lower motor neuron has one very important synapse. And I already kind of explained where the decussation is going to happen at. That one is also happening in the pyramids of the medulla here. So again, same thing. Everything above this, contralateral. Everything below this, ipsilateral. So this is our descending tract, right? That means that we are starting from the top and we are going down because it's descending. So we think about the movement. Our body initiates the movement. The movement's going to travel through here, go through our midbrain, go through our pons, go into the pyramids of the medulla, cross over at the pyramids, go through the white matter tracts of the spinal cord to wherever it is that we need to act at, whether that's the arms, the legs, whatever needs a motor response. It's going to go to that level of the spinal cord. It's then going to enter through and go through the ventral horn, because the ventral horn is what controls our lower motor neuron. And this is the huge transition that happens here. So there we go. Now we exit out as a lower motor neuron through the ganglion. And that is where we always have our ipsilateral response. Always, lower motor neuron is always ipsilateral. Always. And this transition in the spinal cord, that's what tells you whether this is an upper motor neuron or a lower motor neuron. Is if it is at the ventral gray or after, it is a lower motor neuron. If it is anything before the ventral gray, it is an upper motor neuron. All right, so let's hit these nuclei really quick. Just again, as a friendly reminder of where these things are synapsing at. So we're going to start with our cranial nerves, just as, again, a friendly reminder, because we have a lot of cranial nerves that synapse in our brainstem. So we can see that 3 and 4 are part of the midbrain, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are part of the pons, and, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are part of the medulla, mostly, right? And this goes by the rule of 4s. The rule of 4s is extremely helpful in identifying brainstem lesions. If you haven't heard of the rule of 4s, it's a very important rule, and I highly recommend you go watch like another video on that. I might have one too. If not, I'll try and get one up soon on it, because that could be a whole nother video in itself. But the rule of 4s is very, very helpful. So highly recommend checking that out and making sure you understand everything about that. But the rule of 4s is telling you where the cranial nerve nuclei are actually synapsing at. And that's kind of the first piece of the puzzle here. And that's where they test you on your kind of your gross images, right? They're looking for, oh, okay, where are the nuclei in this area at? So I love this image showing you the actual gross image versus the cartoon image, so that way you can kind of compare and see what you're looking for here. But you can see that this section of the midbrain is showing you where the root of cranial nerve 3 is, and then where those fibers exit at. You can also see the medial lemniscus. You can also see the substantia nigra, which I hope you guys remember is a really important piece of a particular disease. which we know is Parkinson's, the pars compacta, cerebropeduncle. So, and the corticospinal fibers are always here in the crus cerebri. We talked about that, right? We talked about that at the very beginning of this presentation, mentioning how the crus cerebri carry those corticospinal, those motor fibers. So if you ever forget, just remember a big piece of the midbrain where those fibers go through is always going to be at the edges here of the midbrain. And your red nucleus, which we also talked a little bit about. So all of these things are very important to be able to identify. Similarly, we have to be able to do this for the pons. So I showed you two kind of different pictures of the pons that you might get here, along with the cartoon image of what you should be seeing. These are definitely must memorize, especially for Med 1 CAS exams, but they do pop up occasionally on other CAS exams too, and STEP as well. There's not going to be a whole lot on those other exams, but it's always good to refresh yourself and try and remember the important pieces. Definitely being able to identify your aqueducts, because that's a huge identification piece to know that we're looking at the level of the pons here. I would say you don't necessarily need to spend your whole time memorizing every small detail, right? But make sure you know where always know where your three main tracts are at. And always know about any cranial nerve nuclei that are in this section. If you know those, 9 times out of 10, you'll be good, as well as the MLF. And then for those of you who are in Med 3 or above, if you notice any that are made or make our neurotransmitters, that's another really important area too to know. So I would say when you go through these, if you're doing it for review for later exams like comp or step, make sure that you know the three main tracts, the cranial nerve nuclei, any aqueducts or anything to do with CSF, and then any pieces that make neurotransmitters. If you're doing this for Med 1, then it might be in your best interest to know those similar things, but definitely the three main tracts and definitely the cranial nerve nuclei. Those are the highest yield of what to know. So you can see this one is a little bit higher of an image, and this one is a little bit lower in the pons. And I know that because we're starting to see the fourth ventricle in this pons image down at the bottom right, versus this very large one where we're seeing the cerebral aqueduct primarily. So if you remember from your CSF drainage, you'll know that the cerebral aqueduct is higher up and will eventually drain into the fourth ventricle. So that's how I know that this one is a higher image and higher up in the brainstem than this one is in the bottom right, which is lower in the brainstem. Then we have the medulla here. So the medulla has a couple important images. I'm showing you one where we're seeing the fourth ventricle, very, very large piece of the fourth ventricle. Also, you can see the olivary nuclei here, these little wiggly worms. These guys are also very, very important. You can also see the pyramids. So these are all very important pieces of the medulla to be able to recognize. So again, we're going to go through and make sure that we know that this is the fourth ventricle. We're going to make sure that we know about the spinal nucleus of cranial and tract of cranial nerve 5. We're going to make sure that we know the medial lemniscus, because this is actually the dorsal columns, right? Medial lemniscus is the same thing as the dorsal columns. Spinal thalamic tract we're going to know. And those are the biggest ones. Oh, MLF. You always need to know the MLF as well. They like that question. So if you know those, then you're pretty much good for this first image. Then the second image here, again, we've kind of gone down a little bit lower now. And same thing, now we can start to see the hypoglossal nucleus. We can see cranial nerve 10, MLF, nucleus ambiguus, medial lemniscus, because that's the dorsal columns, lateral spinal thalamic tract, the pyramids, again, which are carrying motor fibers. All of these things are very important to be able to recognize and make sure that we do know what these are doing and what these are for. Lastly, our spinal cord segments here. So our spinal cord segments are always also important to identify. You can see that the gray matter is going to increase as we go down into the spinal cord segments. We're getting more and more gray matter. You'll also notice the lateral horn is really only found in the thoracic spinal cord. You can see it a little bit in the lumbar spinal cord, but it's usually only seen in the thoracic, and I've only seen questions where the thoracic segment was the correct answer. So being able to identify these segments, they do ask about sometimes. So make sure that you can identify the difference between these spinal cord segments. And again, looking at the gray to white ratio is always very helpful in these cases. Okay, so that was the basics of all of our neurophysiology and all of our tracts. So I'm going to go through about 5 sample questions with you guys right now to show you like how to answer them and what the correct answers are. I'm not going to go through all of the explanations, but you can see that I did leave explanations in the notes section. So you need to open the actual PowerPoint to find all of like the answer choices if that's what you're looking for, something specific. But we'll go through a lot of them because a lot of this is going to be identification. All right, so here's the first question. Either pause the video here or take your time to answer it. And then once you come up with an answer, you can restart the video. Okay, so in this question, we have a 48-year-old woman who's coming to the physician because they have a 1-year history of progressive ringing in her ear. She also has felt dizzy while exercising. Neuro exam shows dysmetria of right upper and lower extremities. Muscle strength and somatosensory function testing of all extremities shows no abnormalities. Audiometry shows moderate hearing loss in the right ear. An MRI of the brain is likely to show a mass compressing which of the following labeled structures in the photograph. So here's another great example of what they're trying to, they're using a gross image and a gross specimen to ask you a question about a specific kind of disease, right? And for the most part, one of the things you should notice is the cranial nerve that's involved here, right? So I hope you guys got that kind of correct. We're talking about cranial nerve 8. Right? Because that's 7. There we go. Cranial nerve 8, because we're having the problems with hearing. Now, something else very, very important to always know about cranial nerve 8 is that cranial nerve 7 and cranial nerve 8 almost always run together. These guys run together. So that means that if there's a mass that's kind of compressing the cranial nerve 8, it's probably also affecting cranial nerve 7. So if you can identify in this image where cranial nerve 7 and 8 would potentially run, then you can get this question correct. And this is actually usually caused by an acoustic neuroma is what this is usually caused by, which causes compression of these 2 nerves, kind of where at the cerebellar pontine angle. And what's interesting about that is that they actually gave you a cross section, not of the cerebellum here, right? Which is interesting, or not of the pons. This, I hope you've identified, is the medulla, right? And we know that because of the olivary nuclei. So we need to find the area where the cerebellum would have some play or some importance. And that's going to be in either area A or area B. And now the next thing you need to recognize is that this is happening to the right ear. And almost always, if it's something that's affecting any of the cerebellar tracts in any way, it is going to be an ipsilateral problem. And so since it's ipsilateral, that's how we're getting to A is our correct answer here. And I've labeled what all these other answer choices here are for you. So A and B are referring to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is being compressed in this case. We also have C and D, which are referring to the medial lemnisci, aka your dorsal columns. And then E and F, which are referring to your medullary pyramids, which again carry your motor fibers. So always know, you can already start to see, we have to know the cranial nerve nuclei, and we have to know those 3 main tracts, and that's what they usually ask about, is any of those 3 things. Okay, moving on to question number 2. Okay, so here for question 2, we have a 69-year-old woman comes to the physician because she has had weakness of her left leg since awakening that morning. Physical exam shows weakness of extremity. A Babinski sign is present on the left. So I hope you already know and recognize that means we're talking about an upper motor neuron lesion, which makes sense because obviously it's showing us a picture of the brain here to identify the problem. So of course it's an upper motor neuron issue. But that also tells you, since we're looking at the brain, I already know before I've even finished reading this question, we're going to know something has to be contralateral here because we know that we're talking about something that's above the decussation here. So it's above the decussation. It must be contralateral. They mention her left leg and they mention everything on the left. We already know we're going to need to look at the right side of the brain. Sensory testing shows decreased somatic sensation in the left foot, agraphisia on the plantar surfaces of the toes, decreased position sense in the toes. An MRI of the brain shows an edematous area in the cerebral cortex of the right hemisphere. The most likely cause of this condition is a lesion located at which the following labeled areas in the photographs of the normal brain. Well, I don't even have to worry about trying to attempt to find the central sulcus in this case. I don't have to worry about finding anything because I already know if it's affecting motor function. I already know it's got to be something to do with a motor cortex. And I already know it has to be along the distribution of the ACA, right? Because we're talking about the lower limb. So all I have to do at this point is find something that's nearest to the motor cortex and under the distribution of the ACA. And the only one that fits those, since we've eliminated everything that was on the left side, is actually G. So similarly, that's it. Kind of done there. Now, this picture's a little weird, right? Because they're kind of showing you two different cross sections, which is a little strange. So it's sometimes I guess it can be somewhat difficult to visualize. But importantly, you always want to again look for the proper area, I guess, of the brain. Like we knew that we were looking for an ACA distribution. So since we're looking for that, we can kind of eliminate everything that's too low. And we can also eliminate everything here because that is all too low to be considered part of the ACA distribution. So either way, no matter how you choose to eliminate it, you can eliminate that picture at the top multiple different ways all at the same time. And here's the motor homunculus like I was talking about. So we really wanted to identify which piece of the puzzle was referring to our ACA distribution and talking about the lower leg. And that would be what we needed to help us kind of answer the questions. A and B are actually talking about the anterior parietal, the post-central gyrus, as well as the posterior frontal, the precentral gyrus. And these areas specifically are on the would involve like the face and the upper extremity loss of sensation because that's part of the MCA distribution. C is talking about the prefrontal cortex. D is talking about the temporal lobes, which would cause Wernicke's. E is the supramarginal gyrus and the inferior lateral parietal lobe. F is looking at the premotor and supplemental motor cortices. And then H is the medial parietal cortex, which is the somatosensory cortex. And then I is the occipital lobe, which would be for vision. And I know I said that all very quickly, but again, it's in the notes section, so you can kind of review those specific areas. All right, let's try question 3. All right, for question 3, we have a 70-year-old man dying of coronary artery disease. He had a cerebral infarction 8 years ago. The photograph of the brainstem is shown. Which of the following neurologic deficits was most likely present in the patient after his cerebral infarction? So, of course, the most important thing that we got to do first is we need to identify exactly which portion of the spinal cord that we're actually looking at, right? And we are looking at the midbrain. That's what we're looking at here. I know it looks weird, but I hope that you notice we're missing this entire huge portion of this on both sides. The right side is fine, but the left side is not even there. It's not even present. So we need to know what should have been on that left side in order to answer this question, right? And I hope you recognize what we talked about was that this is carrying motor fibers. So it has to be something wrong with the motor function. And since we're looking at the motor function, that means that we can get rid of anything that doesn't have anything to do with an upper motor neuron or a lower motor neuron. And since we're in the midbrain, I hope we also recognize this would be an upper motor neuron problem because it's above the decussation. So we're going to get rid of dysmetria, which would be cerebellar, loss of position sense, which could be dorsal column or cerebellar. And we're going to get rid of all of those. And we're left with E and F. And now, again, we have to decide, is it on the left or the right? Like, where would the problem be? And again, this is upper motor neuron above the decussation. This is contralateral. So we have to pick the one in this case that is contralateral because we are above the decussation. So it will be spastic hemiparesis on the right. Here again, kind of just explaining what we just talked about. And then let's move on to question 4. All right, so this is the type of question where I mentioned you kind of have to know generalized areas, right? That's kind of the way, because nothing else is very defined because it's not a cartoon image. So in this case, we have somebody who's in a swimming pool. They can't move their right upper and lower extremities. They think that it's because of a movement deficit, right? So I hope that we already know we are looking for a motor tract. And remember I said, whenever we look at these images, we have to know where our 3 main tracts are. So I hope we recognize that this back here is our dorsal columns. So we know we can eliminate these because we know that those are the dorsal columns. And maybe you forgot, or maybe you're unsure about E and G. One of them is probably corticospinal, one of them is probably spinal thalamic. But how do we know which one's which? Are we talking about maybe an anterior corticospinal? Like, what are we talking about here? But remember, we drew this giant circle that's usually about in the area of E and F here that's referencing our lateral corticospinal tracts, always right there. So we know we're going to be looking for E or F. And indeed, G and H are actually talking about our spinal thalamic tracts. So now we have to decide, is this ipsilateral or this is contralateral? So he can't move the right side. He's having trouble with the right side here. And you know that we're here in the spinal cord, right? But we're also talking about the white matter, correct? Like we're looking at the white matter here. Okay, so the next thing that we have to decide is this upper motor neuron or is this lower motor neuron? Remember, if we're at the level of where the problem is and he's having trouble with both his upper and his lower extremities here, this is the portion where we can for sure say that we are below the decussation, right? We are below the decussation at this point. because we are in the spinal cord, right? We're not in the brainstem. So since we are below the decussation, it has to be ipsilateral. We are below the decussation at this point. So the answer choice would be E, on the right side, because he's having right deficits and we are below the level of the decussation. But it is an upper motor neuron issue because we're in the white matter. So this is a really great example of how we can have an upper motor neuron lesion that's ipsilateral. And this is a good example of how we have to think about upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron separately from ipsilateral and contralateral. All right, moving into the last question, number 5. This has to be my favorite question. So I hope you've made it to this point, because this is where maybe things finally start to come together for you, especially if you have been confused by a lot of this. Here we are talking about something called Brown-Séquard syndrome. And I purposely saved talking about this until last, because to me, this is what makes all of the ipsilateral, contralateral come together and make sense. So the answer to this question is actually going to be E. E is the one that's referring to Brown-Séquard. And I know I got to that a little quickly and I didn't really explain it, but that's because I really want to explain this concept, because to me, this just makes everything come together. When we talk about a hemisection of the spinal cord, everything is always going to be ipsilateral. All of your symptoms will be ipsilateral, except for one thing. And that one thing is your pain and temperature that is actually going to be contralateral. That will be the only one. Now, why is it that that one will be the only one that's going to be contralateral? So in this question specifically, they said that we have problems below the C8 dermatome on the right side, but yet everything below T2, there is left side loss of pain and temperature. That's because remember where the decussation is at for the spinal thalamic tract. The decussation is at the level of the lesion. So we have loss of pain and temperature sensation below the level of the lesion on the contralateral side, below lesion. And look at this picture. Look how they described it. Here's the level of the injury at C8, and look at the left-sided loss of pain and temperature contralateral everywhere else below the lesion because of the decussation. I really think that this syndrome drives home the point that I was trying to make about how you really have to pay attention to whether the lesion is above the decussation or below. And in the case of the spinal thalamic, everything will always be contralateral unless you are at the level of the lesion, in which case that will be the only time you have an ipsilateral lesion of pain and temperature. And I find it so interesting. And to me, this really drives it home about the decussation theories. So I hope that this helped clear up any of your concerns about the spinal thalamic, the dorsal column, and the motor tracts. I hope that this helps you at least a little bit clear up any of that. And if you do have any further questions, please feel free to let me know, and I'll try and answer your questions. See you guys later.